What would you do if you saw something that completely defied your understanding of reality? Would you embrace it, be fearful of it, or dismiss it altogether? As much as we may like to confine our experience of reality into a nice, neat little package, there are occasions in which we simply can't. And maybe we'll ask, what is really going on? Well, if there's anyone who can break down all of the possible explanations of the weirdness of reality, it's Cynthia Sue Larson. Called the Quantum Optimist, Cynthia lends the perfect blend of scientific discovery with an imaginative and lucid insight that says all things are possible. With what you're about to hear, you may want to reconsider what reality is truly all about. I am so delighted to welcome back one of this show's favorite guests and one of our newest regular contributors for higherjourneys.com. That's the quantum optimist herself, Cynthia Sue Larson. Cynthia, thanks so much for coming on the show at such short notice. How are you? How's everything going? Good.
Well, I just had that great conference last week, but I'm still, as I say, coming, off the high from that. But it was fantastic. Foundationsofmind.org, and wonderful conference with Henry Stapp. Lots of great consciousness researchers, fields from many different disciplines.
Excellent. Yeah, I know you were busy. Now, did you speak at this, or were you part of the organizing committee, or both?
Both. Yes, I was part of the organizing committee, and I spoke at this conference as well. I was speaking about complexity science and the way that it intersects with some of the quantum phenomena that we observe.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're certainly going to be interjecting your quantum perspective on what we're going to be talking about today, so I want to get right into that. And I knew you'd be the go-to person, Cynthia, on this, because we're going to talk about a couple of stories, and let's get into that. You and I spoke yesterday. We had, albeit a brief, but as always, a deep and intriguing discussion about a subject that I'm going to dub anomalies of reality. Now, as I was listening recently to one fascinating account, which the audience is going to hear shortly, I have to tell you, this is one of the most bizarre stories I think I've ever heard in all my years of fringe research. And it's a story told by none other than Jordan Maxwell. Many of you know that name. He's one of the top fringe researchers, I think, on the planet. After I heard this brief story, I began to think about other such reality-bending scenarios that I'd heard, particularly recently. And so another one of them, which the audience will hear as well, comes from a recent interview I did with author and motivational speaker Dianne Bischoff James. But before we let the audience listen into these original accounts, I want you to set up, Cynthia, the framework for this discussion. I mean, we're talking about events and experiences that just don't fit within the so-called normal confines of reality. What we're talking about is essentially a plastic or malleable reality, a fluid reality. Give us, if you would, a general overview of how reality can be so flexible and literally defy the rules of what we call classical physics. And then we're going to get into the accounts themselves.
Right. Well, one important aspect to keep in mind is that through the history of humanity, there have been those called shaman and those involved with seeing other aspects of reality, what you might call the true nature of reality. And others have called it, such as Henri Corbin, called it the imaginal realm. Mm-hmm. And so when you get into that area, that's what I'd like people to keep in mind, that sometimes we can see into that imaginal realm. We can see what you might call the operational aspects of that are sort of the behind-the-scenes working of reality itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting that you brought up Henri Corbin. I am familiar with his work in the imaginal. And, as I was sort of pondering what we're going to be hearing shortly, I don't know that I thought of, I don't want to tip my hat too much because I want the audience to hear it, but imaginal realm, that's something that I definitely would like to bring into the discussion because I hadn't thought about it in that regard as I was listening to these accounts. So let's get right into this first account. As mentioned, this is a story that was recently told by alternative researcher Jordan Maxwell during an interview he did just last month in April on the Sage of Quay radio show. In fact, I'm going to put a link to the interview so you can listen to this great episode in its entirety. But for now, take a listen to this short account that Jordan describes as it was told to him by someone who witnessed what I'm going to call a delayed impact. Let's listen in.
I got a friend who was working for, the sheriff's department, police department, forgot exactly what it was. It was working for the state and law enforcement. But he was telling me, and I don't know where it happened. This was a story quite a while back. But he said that he was standing by this big high rise on the street, and some guy was up on the roof working on this high rise, maybe 30 stories high, and fell off. And he said, I didn't know he fell off. I'm just standing there. And he said, when the guy hit the concrete right there near me, I happened to be facing where he hit. And he said, when he hit the concrete from falling 30 stories up, he bounced about 8 foot off the concrete. Once he hit it, he bounced up. And then when he was coming down after bouncing, he collapsed on his feet. I mean, he stood on his feet. And he took off his gloves and said, damn it, something to that effect, damn it, and took off his gloves and then instantly collapsed into a pool of blood. But for a moment, he took off his gloves, realized what had happened, and said, damn it, and then completely collapsed into bones and blood. As you can imagine, you thought that's what would have happened immediately. No, it didn't happen immediately.
Yeah.
For a second or two, he was still together, knew what he had done, took off his gloves and said, I'll be damned, something like that, and then collapsed into a blood blister on the sidewalk. I mean, that's strange stuff.
Wow. Bizarre indeed. Strange indeed. You know, you and I spoke a little bit about this specific account just yesterday, and you made some very interesting assessments about how something like this could be possible in a plastic or flexible reality. Cynthia, give me your weigh in on this, and then I'd like to throw a couple of theories out to you that maybe you could shed some light on as well.
Okay. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is this is obviously an out of the ordinary experience in the sense that most of us, at least I think, have not experienced anything like it, myself included. And I've seen a lot of weird things, but this is way past the level of anything I've personally witnessed. Having said that, it does seem to me to be representative of, as I said before the clip played, this sense that sometimes we can get a glimpse, the observer, whoever it is that witnessed that horrific experience, because it's pretty grisly ending, but for a moment there, where the bounce occurred and then landing on the feet and then just having a few words to say, it seems like reading into a hope or an expectation or maybe a dream or a feeling that person might be wanting to do. You know, like as they're falling, they might wish, like, I wish I could bounce like a ball. I wish I could land on my feet. And then this is what I'd be saying, you know, those 4-letter, expletive deleted remarks, but that's certainly called for in the circumstances.
To say the least.
Yeah, it's pretty upsetting. So
It is.
So in a sense, it seems like the witness is observing what you might call the mental state of the person who's experiencing the fall and who would wish that they could bounce, wish they could land on their feet, wish they could say something. But then it's like everything collapsed to what collective consensus reality would call for in such an experience. And so a case could be made that if our consensus reality could include such things as weightlessness, as people flying through the air, anti-gravity kind of things, then we could have it. And, up until the time that we can consider such things real, then if you fall from a building, then there's not going to be any such solution at hand, would be the expectation.
Well, it's interesting that you focus on the witness's perspective, because that was probably the first thing that I pondered as I listened to this. Could it be that it was the eyewitness whose brain processed this event as delayed? And I stress processed. In other words, did he experience a different reality or even a superimposed reality when in actuality the tragic event happened as most would expect it to, death upon impact after, falling?
Absolutely. And that is that's exactly where I'm going with
That's what
this.
I thought. Yeah.
Now, there's a great author, Don Hoffman, who wrote a book on visual perception that I reviewed about 10, 13 years ago. And now Donald Hoffman is coming into the forefront of the field of consciousness by explaining that when we sense things, it's very much as if we're seeing things that aren't real, that what we're seeing is in fact very much like an icon on a desktop, like we would expect to see on the computer. And you can actually, if you're having a hard time believing something like that, you can just acknowledge the fact that the way that sound and light arrive in our minds, in our brains, they come in at different times, yet our brain somehow is able to coordinate all of these inputs and treat it as if it's incoming simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, the work of researcher Benjamin Libet proved that we often can have awareness of sensation in our body before there's any way that we should be able to sense it. So there's definitely something going on with our sensory perceptions, reality, and our mind, and it's not the way that we would expect that the whole system works. Uh-huh. There definitely seems to be a lot of interplay allowing for this glimpsing of this imaginal realm, this perhaps deeper reality, so that the witness is actually able to see what the person who's falling, or perhaps also the witness, would wish. But then there's this collapse to the collective conscious preference of reality. And I do bring this up because in my research with reality shifts and quantum jumps, it absolutely makes a difference when there's a prevalence of people whose wishes are pushing a result in a desired direction. This is called EPR steering, and it was suggested by Schrodinger, the physicist, that you could actually influence the effects of the Schrodinger's cat in the box.
Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with that somewhat, yeah. So I guess, could I surmise that the event, as it was described by Jordan, did not necessarily happen? In other words, could it have been, he didn't say whether there were other people, I would imagine there would have to have been another person or several around, and of course, if so, we didn't get that testimony, but could it be that, or I guess what I'm asking is, could we rule out then, possibly, that it didn't actually happen that way universally, but only in the processing of an individual witness's, brain process? Or could we even, not that it's any more bizarre, but could we imagine that the whole of reality was bent as this person, plummeted but bounced? And what would you say of other people? Let's make some assumptions. Let's assume that there were several other people around and that they witnessed the same exact thing, just for argument's sake.
Yeah, and that's quite an assumption to make. What I do notice quite often, for example, with reality shift experiences, such as synchronicities, miraculous changes, people, things appearing, disappearing, transporting, transforming, is that sometimes you do get people agreeing with what they believe occurred, and that's a wonderful thing when that happens for those of us who experience these reality shifts, because actually it's really nice to have people who agree with you on what just occurred. Right. But we're getting increasing amounts of evidence that alternate histories do exist, which indicates increasingly to me that a lot of what we experience, although we wish that it would be shared experience, to some degree, often it may be shared, but it may be shared with some other aspect of ourselves, that it seems like our consciousness itself is experiencing a multitude of possible realities at the same time. And when you feel like you're scattered, it's quite possible you literally are scattered. For example, when I've been daydreaming, I've been noticed to be bilocating at those times of daydreaming.
Really?
Yes. So
elaborate on that, if you would. That the bilocation subject is also equally intriguing to me. Talk about that a little bit.
Okay. So first time it occurred that I'm aware of was when my daughters were quite young, and I had just gone through a divorce. So I was alone with them in the house and needed to wake them up. It was a cold morning. I didn't feel like getting out of bed, and so instead of getting out of bed the way I knew I should, I started, like sometimes people do, imagining that I got out of bed, imagining I walked down the hall, imagining I flipped on their light, said, "Good morning, girls, time to get up," like I always did, walked over to their window with the shade that's way too heavy for them to do anything with, gave it a tug and made it sure it went all the way up so the room was full of light, and that was my daydream. So I'm daydreaming that, and I'm just sort of thinking, wow, I really should get out of bed. A few more moments pass, and then I hear voices from down the hall, and I think, wow, they got themselves up. That's unusual. And then there's more and more noise. and then a pitter-patter of little feet, and then they come into my room, and then my daughters say, "Mommy, what are you doing back in bed?" And that's my first clue something is really weird.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean back in bed? Now, I have not moved. I mean, the air feels cold. It's like, I don't want to get out of bed. And now I think, okay, what do you mean? And I said, you saw me? You heard me in your room? And they said, yes. And I just find that impossible to believe. So at that point, I'm a little concerned. So I stood up, like, who was in their room? So, I'm a protective mother. Walk down the hall, look in the room, the light's on. The window shade is all the way open properly. Believe me, they could not do that. This was an ornery thing to to deal with. And I said, I was in here? And they said, yes. And that was the first time that occurred. It did happen again. Another time I was daydreaming, this time at a book event, much more recently in the last 10 years. So I was supposed to be at a book event, and I was there. But it was a really nice day outside, and I could see through the windows what a nice day it was. I saw trees and clouds, and I started daydreaming that I was walking down a street that I love to stroll down in Berkeley, and it's called Solano Avenue. Beautiful street. Lots of cute little shops. So the daydream didn't have much to it other than I was just enjoying the sunshine and walking along the street. And I sort of snapped out of it and, as soon as someone came by to talk about the books again. But then when I got home later that day or the next, I got an email from a friend who said, "Cynthia, I thought you were supposed to be at a book event in Concord this weekend." I said, "Yes." And I wrote back, "Yes, I was. Why?" And then she wrote back, "I could have sworn I saw you on Solano Avenue." And I wrote back, "What time was this?" It was exactly the same time.
That you were having the daydream.
Yes.
Wow. Well, I say wow. All of these things fall in the wow factor, the wow category. But now we're getting into, as we talk about bilocation. And by the way, everyone, these are all what we would consider anomalies of reality. The idea of bilocation, you don't hear it talked about too much. Those of us in the field certainly have heard some accounts of it. But when you think of particularly the two stories that you just shared, you also can't help but think of out-of-body experience, and could that have been somehow incorporated into your experiences? Were you perhaps, we could talk about teleportation. There's so many other little factors that come into play when you're talking about this sort of thing. Could you have literally left your body while you were in your bed, talking about your daughters and going into the room and waking them up and pulling the shade up, and they're seeing you? It was Robert Monroe, I believe, that spoke about at great length in his work in out-of-body travel, that how he was able to affect other people's perception, and they could see him as he was going about doing whatever, whether he was coming into their home or whatever. So all of these things have to be taken into account. Let's throw the imaginal realm in there. Andre
yes.
Corbin, where does this fall in with all of these things? Now we get a whole kettle of fish here to look at.
Well, with this field of consciousness, it really does, to me, tie in closely with what we're noticing with quantum phenomena. And I do bring that up because I'm not claiming to have found the quantum paradigm, which is like the holy grail for physics. When they find that, then they will probably also have the theory of everything, where you can tie together, the large-scale phenomena and principles and forces operating in the cosmos with the very, very small. But we don't quite have it yet. What we do have is mathematical equations that work quite well enough that we can create nuclear power plants, nuclear weaponry, and we think we know what we're doing. That was fine, but we're about to move into quantum computers. And at that point, we actually do need to know what the logic is. And that would serve us best if we could figure that out, so that we understand what we're creating when we create artificial intelligence with quantum computers. Because it would be nice to be able to control that to some degree, or to have some degree of security on such a system, and to know what the interaction with consciousness actually is. Those things we don't have quite pinned down just yet. So we've got theories, and we've got various interpretations, such as the holographic interpretation that David Bohm came up with. I love that one. I love that, because that shows that everything is all as one. And then you've got various variations of multiverse theories, which are made famous by Hugh Everett III, talking about the many worlds interpretation. A personal favorite of mine that also few people seem to really know about, but it's the transactional interpretation by one of our living physicists, John Kramer, up at University of Seattle, Washington. That's a handshake through time and space, and it's the way that all of physics can be explained on the quantum level that way, which I think is brilliant. So those are three of my personal favorites, and just like California cuisine, sometimes we have what you might call a Thai burrito with Thai food and Mexican food. And I kind of like to do that with these interpretations because, to me, there are some good ones here. I really love the holographic model, the way it ties everything together as one. Yes. And I also love the multiverse. I love to have the multiverse in the hologram so that there is a oneness. But at the same time, you can go exploring through all these multiple possible realities that Henri Corbin tends to indicate with that whole idea of the imaginal realm.
Okay. I'm thinking of these interpretations and how, again, going back to our first story, they might offer some framework for how such a thing could occur, even if it were just in the brain of the eyewitness, or in the eye of the witness, I should say. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, are we talking about what type of a quantum theory might make this possible if we haven't talked about it already?
Yeah, I'll have to be honest with you and say that currently there isn't really a set way to tie consciousness in with quantum physics other than, some people try, and you've got the Penrose-Hameroff model of, the orchestrated OR theory, which is microtubules in the brain. But that doesn't really, to me, it's just pointing different directions, and still we haven't solved the actual problem within physics itself. So that's tying physics into the brain and saying, okay, here, the consciousness can happen here, and that you just point at microtubules. But the trouble is, even if you do that, we still don't really know what the heck is going on here, and how does this tie everything together. So that piece of it is still, you sometimes hear the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. And to me, that hard problem is not really solved. It's like, how do you make consciousness tie in with quantum physics? And you can kind of press it together, and it's like a puzzle piece that you force in the puzzle and say it fits. But to me, I think we're looking at it wrong. I think, there's something about consciousness itself. We know when we're conscious, but as yet within science, we have no way to measure it, no way to really test for it, no way to predict its presence, absence, or change. And so until we can do that, we're out of our depth, actually.
Yeah.
And these questions that you're asking, which are wonderful questions, what did that observer notice, and what others have noticed the same thing? I would hazard a guess that different people would notice different things.
Right.
You might be able to get to a point of coherence where the observers are in synchrony, like a flock of birds, and that they do recognize something happening similarly. That can happen. It does happen when that level of entanglement of the group is pretty strong. These are quantum phenomena. These are quantum attributes that we're describing here.
Right, absolutely.
That's one way to look at it.
Well, somehow I think there's a common thread, even though we haven't been able to find words to put on what that common thread is, that take all of these things into account. And we probably have, in a sense, touched upon this. But in terms of, the whole idea, Cynthia, of reality perhaps being a simulation, i.e. the Matrix, if that were to be the case, would that not make situations like this far more plausible? A simulation. I'm literally talking about a virtual reality here. And
that's one way to call it. And then the flip side of that same exact coin, it's the same darn coin, you flip it over, and then you're looking at what I said Donald Hoffman is calling it. He is at the University of California, Irvine, and he studies visual perception and the mind and consciousness. And what he's noticed is that the way we receive information is not what is really out there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
all of reality is as if it's just like icons in a desktop. We don't need to know when you throw something in the trash on your computer what exactly is happening. You don't need to know how input output registers are changing and what's happened with the machine language and what data store has just been dumped. That's way too technical, and it's totally irrelevant for you. All you need to know is you put that file icon into the trash icon, and voila, it has been disposed of. But and that's basically what Donald Hoffman is saying is going on with all of our senses, all around us, all the time. And so I like that approach, because instead of assuming that we're living in this sort of there's an assumption made when you call it a matrix, when you call it a holodeck. It sounds like someone constructed it. And when you look at it from the flip side, this side of saying, well, you know what? None of our senses are real. Everything we're getting information about is just an artifact. It's just like we're not really seeing the way things truly are.
Right.
I love that. I
do
that.
too.
Love that.
Okay, so I think that sort of the words that I'm using, simulation, virtual reality, and matrix, are somewhat akin to what this gentleman is saying. So many different variations of, I think we're really kind of driving at some similar themes for sure. Well, Kate, I want to now have the audience listen into this next bizarre account. And this was recently told to me in my interview with Dianne Bischoff James. Now, I want to preface this by saying that my talk with Dianne was more focused on the dynamics of manifestation and reality creation through innovative and fun practices. It was a very upbeat chat. But at the end, I asked her to share a story with our audience that she told me a couple of years ago when we were together sitting in a restaurant just talking and trading stories back and forth. As a matter of fact, Cynthia, we were in San Mateo, started to say San Francisco, San Mateo, California for the New Living Expo. That's when we met, and that's when she told me this story. And this is somewhat of a dark story as well. It truly falls into the high strangeness category. This is what I will call an actual shape-shifting event. Listen to this.
I saw something that it wasn't until I had this experience that I really, I'm open to everything on spirituality. I'm open to everything metaphysical. I'm open to everything in this plane of existence. But it wasn't until I had this experience that it really, confirm that there really is, as much as there is a lightness, there also is a darkness, and that's the part that was interesting to me. I had one of my relationships when I was single was with a person who had a very, very, very strong active addiction, and it's one of the favorite stories in the book. But he took me from this place of lightness and manifestation and positivity and growth to looking at the darkness of life that I've never ever seen before. It involved everything from getting arrested. He was incarcerated. He had things happening to his body that were just horrible, and it was all because of his addiction and because of all the terrible things that went along with that addiction. But once he went to his mother's house, and his family had a very strange dynamic. The mother was very strong, very controlling, and they too probably were participating in other addictions. But he went out to go fix something, and he was in the backyard, and his mom made him come back and said, "You've got to fix our telephone system." So he tried. He went out. He was an electrical engineer. He actually had multiple masters. He was brilliant. And he came back in, and I was out there with him in the yard, and I said, "Are you an electrician, or are you a telephone guy?" And he goes, "No." And I said, "Then how are you going to fix this?" He's like, "I don't know, but my mom said I had to." And this is a 44-year-old man. I'm like, okay. Well, I sat there watching him for a while, and then we came back into the kitchen, and he goes, "Mom," and she was just sitting there, and it was kind of like dark room, dark kitchen. It was almost 5 or 6, and it was getting to be dark outside, and she had one light over her head. And she snapped her head, and she looked at him, and she goes, "How dare you?" And I swear her entire face turned gray. Her eyes turned black. I saw blackness in the center of her eyes, and it was as if her skin turned a color, like the color of death. It's the only color I can think to describe it. It's like that sallowy, whitish gray color. And it was as if, weirdly, like she was possessed almost by an entity, a creature, a serpent, I don't know what it was, and I just stared at her because I'd walked in the door. He looked at her, I looked at her, and then in less than, like another couple seconds, it all went back to looking like this older woman who was very sick and had like a lot of veins on her face, so kind of the blood came back. And I just stood there in the doorway, and I thought, I think I've just seen something that's not of this world.
Okay, there you go. Now, the idea of shape-shifting may not be too unfamiliar to many in the audience, as we've discussed subjects like the ET influence and more specifically the reptilian influence in the past. So this is, I don't think, completely foreign to a lot of folks listening. But certainly, and I should say certainly the subject has been discussed in many fringe and alternative circles, but it's still somewhat unsettling and perplexing. And I'd love to get your weigh-in on how you think something like this, an individual shifting their appearance right before your very eyes, could happen. How is this so? Are we talking about something similar here?
Yes, and again, it's very similar to what I said on the last one as well. This is a different situation entirely, but again, here we've got shape-shifting, and this is the realm of what shamans have spoken about for millennia. Again, and if you read a book such as The World is As You Dream It by John Perkins, you actually can read about well, not exactly similar, but you can read about experiences of shape-shifting in that book, where he actually went through customs with things that he should have been contraband as you're going through an airport, and conveniently those things that were totally inappropriate in an airport, I think it might have been arrows or something, transformed into something innocuous. Once he'd cleared security, then it transformed back. So that was a modern day example of shape-shifting. But the sort of thing that happened here, again, it sounds like more like the X-Files or something.
It sure does.
What is this?
Yeah.
Very, very creepy. The other thing that I'd say that's reminiscent of the first clip you played, again, we're looking at what I would call the imaginal realm and seeing into a deeper underlying reality. And I hesitate to say anything negative about that. Unfortunately, it's a really terrible thing what happened with that whole family, and my heart goes out to them. And dealing with substance abuse is nothing to laugh at. And, there, for the grace of God, go any of us, actually.
That's right.
But obviously, something was going on, and I don't know what that was exactly, but when Dianne's sensing, like, wow, the eyes changed, there was this change in the skin, gives me oh my gosh, my hairs are standing on end. Just thinking about it again, it's like, oh gosh.
Yeah, it's a little creepy, and yet not as uncommon as we might think,
Right. So when you recognize that what Dianne might have been seeing was the other, this inner aspect, if you will, of perhaps the mental place that this woman was coming from, or what you might say was running the show. The consciousness that was directing that woman's speech and words and attitude and demeanor and energy and everything. Mm-hmm. And so what Dianne's actually seeing is kind of like the operator running the puppet behind the scene. It's like that's the real spirit at work here.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this story, as bizarre as it is, again, may seem to be a little bit more familiar, even from a cult fiction standpoint. I mean, you think of The Exorcist and the classic possession, if you can use those two words together. Again, not funny at all, but you do think of the famous movie The Exorcist, in which Linda Blair plays the possessed young girl, and again, you see a physical shift in her eyes, her expression, and of course her voice. So I guess you could, if you wanted to, if you had to put it in a bucket, put it into a more classical possession or possession phenomenon. But here's a point I want to make, and I want to get your weigh in on this. I have heard quite a few stories that broadly fall into this area of what we would call shape-shifting, particularly when they're described and similar to the way Dianne has described them. And Cynthia, it seems that emotion plays a very curious role in these sort of physical transformations. I've heard of this before. In fact, in my interview recently with ET researcher Barbara Lamb, she spoke of a similar situation where one of the hybrids and the ET hybrids that she interviewed in her book she co-wrote, Meet the Hybrids. She talks about one of the hybrids witnessing another so-called hybrid shifting their appearance into a reptilian form. And this, by the way, wasn't brought up in a negative sense. It was just seeing this transformation with this other person's eyes, clearly. What would you do if the beloved pet you had to put down only months ago suddenly showed up at your doorstep? Or you had a dream that your animal companion told you they would be returning to you. Hi, I'm Alexis Brooks, and after having my own amazing animal return experience, I've put together a compelling presentation called The Evidence for Animal Reincarnation, Clues, Characteristics, Confirmation, that include miraculous stories just like mine that happen to real people just like you. You'll hear powerful accounts of animals returning to their owners after they've died. You'll find out if you can actually encourage your lost pet to return to you and ways to learn whether they already have. Take a deep dive into the historical beliefs around reincarnation. Learn about synchronicity, intuition, and even dreams and how they all factor into this miraculous phenomenon. To learn more about this unique presentation and to purchase your copy, visit higherjourneys.com/animal reincarnation. That's higherjourneys.com/animal reincarnation. And maybe you too will witness the return of your animal friend that you've been so longing to see. You're listening to Higher Journeys Radio with Alexis Brooks. And now, back to our program.
I think you're making a very valid point about the different ways that this is viewed, and shapeshifting is perfectly appropriate. I didn't mean to say that this was definitely a case of, exorcism. Need to call in the exorcist.
Yeah,
but
in some cases it might. I think we're just talking about the phenomenon broadly. That it's possible that we live in this plastic reality that will allow for such things to happen. But again, the emotion point—that's the thing that I've always found quite interesting. I mean, let's look at certain religious practices, and I recall as a child attending, we never belonged to the Pentecostal or some of the really, really devout sort of Baptist denominations, religions, in which you will see an individual in church during service start to speak in tongues. And it starts with heavy emotion. It ends with heavy emotion, but transformation takes place. And I always thought, why do I think that emotion plays some role in whatever the transformation is, whether you're moving into speaking in this language that no one's ever heard or physically changing your appearance. So somehow emotion seems to be a trigger.
Absolutely. And I notice it in terms of getting into what athletes would call a flow state, and I think it may be similar for people who are speaking in tongues to get into that flow state where they get their analytical mind out of the way, and it feels like you're running on more pure spirit energy, more pure, just this sense of, being alive, and then it can feel like a rush. So I think that's a commonality perhaps. Mm-hmm. Between, accessing that level of awareness. Right. And I do some of that when I work with clients. I sometimes can get into I would prefer to go into a higher state of consciousness, which is what I like to do, to raise the level a bit rather than, there's no need to go into the angry or those kind of energies that take, form perhaps as what you might call a reptilian hybrid. Mm. But what I'm preferring to access would be more of the angelic realms, and those are more easily accessed through love, through sense of joy, and what you might call higher emotions. But I think it's interesting that if you saw that movie Inside Out that Disney put together, that was done on the work of a researcher who has done a lot of work with facial microexpressions, and he's doing a project with the Dalai Lama that the Dalai Lama funded for $750,000 to map the continents of emotion. There are 5 major ones, and it's a world peace project that he's doing. And Disney got wind of it and said, hey, those 5 emotions could be useful. And that's how they came up with the Inside Out characters, basically showing anger and joy and fear and disgust, and I think that was most of them, but sadness. I think there we go. So when you get those those global emotions that really are global. They're not cultural. That was the original assumption, that there's some difference, but there isn't. And those are gateways. Each one of those 5 major continents of emotion can take you places. So if you're choosing to go with joy, then you're going to go to a different destination than you would if you're traveling on fear.
Ah, that is interesting. And that is very relevant, as what you just said, that the emotion that is brought up seems to be the entry point or the gateway to whichever reality you will end up experiencing. Literally. Right. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, emotions are keys. They're the keys that open those doors. You're right. And you can test it yourself when you try to remember something from your own memory. It can be very difficult to access certain memories unless you're in a similar emotional state. Mm-hmm. And sometimes smells can bring us to that emotional state. They can act like a prompt. And then from there, then boom, you're in the whole memory.
I would think that all senses could play some role in that. I think of hearing someone's voice or even seeing somebody that looks like somebody else that you've never met before would also, all of the physical senses, I think, have the potential of doing that. I
think smell is one of the first ones that comes online in the human brain. So it's so primal, and it's because it's so pre-verbal. That's one that people can relate to. But you're right; they all can.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? How we're talking about anomalies of reality, everyone, and yet I think Cynthia hit upon something that in order to experience much of the strangeness of reality, and strange not necessarily being bad, but just being not the norm. The emotion, I think we've hit on something. It seems to be the possible impetus, or can provide the impetus for the reality. And let's take this all the way back to the first clip that we heard with Jordan Maxwell talking about this eyewitness, because I have a feeling he is very key in this scenario. Again, in that he perhaps, the emotion of witnessing, or the act of witnessing somebody taking a plummet like that, and the emotion that would immediately arise as this person is descending, of what adjective could we use? Just absolute fear, just shock. And that emotion, being a very, very condensed energy, could have perhaps opened a gateway to an alternate reality, so he didn't see what was going to be inevitable immediately.
Yes, so there'd be fear, disgust, and sadness and surprise. So sort of a blend of those.
Yeah. And so there's something else, another term that kind of comes to mind when we're witnessing what we think is a certain reality or during an encounter, let's say. It's a term that Mary Rodwell, another fabulous ET researcher and regression therapist, has used, and that is screen memory. And that's when you're witnessing something that is so out of the norm that your brain, once again, or something is causing you to screen it with something else. Have you heard that term before, screen memory?
Yes, and I think it's an interesting one because it brings to me the idea of, remember that today we've been talking about bilocation, and so it's interesting when you look at experiences of experiencing simultaneous multiple realities, like I have personally witnessed, and I think a lot of us do, actually, but it hasn't been. We don't have that buzzword going for it as screen memories. But I believe that this phenomenon occurs quite regularly, and that this quantum logic, this quantum process is all around us all the time. What you might call the matrix or the plasticity of reality. These are similar ways to look at the same thing. And absolutely, yes, there's something going on for sure. When we have a screen memory, it's the brain's way or the mind's way of coping with the fact that we've got so many, perhaps simultaneous concurrent realities, that would create a schizophrenic viewpoint. And we know that's crazy. So therefore, we can't hold that many simultaneously. We shut some down. And this is what you would see in a computer processor. When we start getting quantum artificial intelligence running, we'll be seeing exactly this very thing happening, where there will be a superposition of states attained. The computer, the artificial intelligence will be cognizant of many superpositional realities, and instead of holding all of them, it's going to be selecting one so it can interface with humans and talk about one outcome. Because, right now humans are not yet aware that we too are probably experiencing more than one reality at a given time.
Right. I think that's just a what word would I use? Just phenomenal possibility that we're constantly just, what do I want to say? Just vacillating between one reality and another without our even realizing it. I think there's something very relatable to that. I can relate to that. Anyway, I don't know. My mind's going. I think I'm traversing is the word I wanted to use. I think I'm traversing a few different realities at the moment. But before we're gonna cut this a little bit shorter today. But before we close out, I want you and I talked offline, and I said, would you? Now you've already shared quite the bizarre bilocation story with us. But Cynthia, if you could share one other little bizarre or high strange account that you have witnessed, I'd love for you to share it with us.
Yeah, we did talk about one. I just want to make sure I'm picking one that you want the most. So
what okay. Are you feeling like you want to tell?
Oh my gosh. For me it's there's so many. And for me it's an almost daily occurrence. So, which is nice because after 17 years of researching it, it's not so startling and almost terrifying at times. Now it seems more normal. Like, well, of course, reality's plastic. Things move. This happens, of course. Right. But, I think one that a lot of people contact me about a lot is bringing people back from the dead, actually. It's one of you may think that's odd, but that's probably I get the largest number of emails related to that very topic because they've read about in my book Reality Shifts, where I describe an experience where my previous roommate's cat, Ashes, that I'd gotten to know and love because I lived in the same apartment with my roommate Catherine for many years. And then when I moved across the street, I continued to see the cat Ashes because he would come across and visit in the backyard garden where I was renting a house across the street. Mm-hmm. So it was all quite normal until one day I noticed it had been a few days since I'd seen Ashes, and I was hoping he was all right. So I called out to Catherine. Catherine, what is Ashes okay? I haven't seen him recently. And she just looked she looked like I'd gut punched her. And she said, oh, he died. He was hit by a car. And then I was devastated. I was like, oh man, that's terrible. And I didn't think much more of it. But then a little while later, I was in the back garden. Well, obviously I would wish he hadn't died. And I hadn't seen him get hit by a car. So I'm pointing out these things because I think they are relevant. Anyway, I was in the back garden, and one day Ashes was there. He was walking a little stiffly, and his fur didn't look as well kept as usually. He'd be fastidious, really clean. He'd just lick himself until he was shining all over, and the fur kind of a gray and black and some tips of white color combination, kind of like the leopard kind of cat with stripes, but beautifully made out. But he seemed a little almost greasy, sort of like he was kind of getting a bit decrepit, a little bit arthritic, so he would move with a little hitch in his giddy up, so to speak. But the thing is, I was just so happy to see him. I could not believe it because I remembered, or I thought I remembered, that's the other funny thing. I felt like there had been a reality where Catherine had told me he'd been hit by a car, but here he was. He's alive. And so I double-checked it with my husband, and I said, look, here's Ashes. Do you remember? And this often happens, too, where you refer this incident to someone else, and they don't quite know what you're talking about. Like, well, of course he's fine. He's right here. Mm-hmm. But then they start, if you press the matter, they might start remembering, like, wait a minute, I think I did hear you tell me that he had died. So it's a very interesting experience. And again, we talked about emotions today. That I believe that's such a key for experiencing any kind of change in reality, this plastic reality. And it really does help. For me, I think the love I felt for Ashes was integral in his returning. In my experience of then next experiencing a reality where Ashes, maybe something had happened to him, but he was alive. I don't think he could have been hit by a car because that would have killed him or maimed him. He wasn't maimed. He wasn't hurt. He was just kind of creaky. It's like an injured Ashes.
I have to tell you, as soon as you started talking about Ashes, just guess who just walked in?
Oh!
Clover Paws must have heard us. Isn't
Yes.
that something? Well, hi, Clover Paws. I'm not done yet. I'll be off in a little while. I have to ask you, the Ashes story, and I do recall you vaguely telling me that story before, but let's look at a couple of things here. We have a few more minutes. I want to get into this just a tad more. Your husband witnessed Ashes as well after he vaguely recalled being told that Ashes was hit by a car, correct? But he saw him with you.
Yes.
How long did the appearance occur, and did you see Ashes again after that?
Well, I saw him many times after that.
Really?
From then on, it was as if he had never been hit by a car, and he just lived out. I mean, he was kind of getting decrepit, though. He didn't live like years later. Maybe it was almost a year, months later. But still, for me, that was wonderful because I just wasn't ready for him to be gone.
Mm-hmm.
When you love someone, whether it's a pet or an animal or a person, there can be quite a strong connection, and
Right.
I still felt a strong connection.
Right, that's something. So my question to you is, Cynthia, given that there's really no complete line of demarcation between one version of reality or the other, what do you think, that being said, but also that one may be more valid than the other, what do you think was the virtual reality, simulated reality? Were you daydreaming, do you think, that your friend told you that he was hit by a car?
Okay, this is a good question. In this case, what I'm really saying is that when we experience different realities, this is not so much an example of a virtual where we're seeing something that isn't quite real, but we're glimpsing into the, if you will, the puppet master pulling the strings. Instead, this is the way nature works. Anytime there's any kind of a genetic mutation, which can be for our benefit, anytime a plant photosynthesizes. There are quantum processes happening in nature every minute of every day in very warm, wet, noisy environments. And so, in other words, living beings, animals and plants both, are choosing between superpositions of states as if they know what they're doing, as if they can see all of the possibilities, and they're routinely choosing ones that are either most advantageous or most interesting. Mm-hmm. And I would say that is what's happening. So I think, at the same time, is anything that we're ever sensing real, or is it all the icons on a desktop? I'd say it's all icons on a desktop. So, given that, however, the truth is that what I was witnessing there is that superposition of states, that there were a couple of possible realities. And I think due to the love I felt for Ashes, it just felt like, no, that can't be true. I didn't know I was doing that, but I just felt such a strong connection to the cat. And it's the only example I've currently had in my life of someone coming back from the dead. I do have I can't tell you how many emails I get from people who really want to bring back a loved one. Mm-hmm. It's extremely common. And they get hopeful. They've seen my YouTube videos and such. And the thing is, I do believe it's possible, but the state of detachment required, you actually have to get to a place of simultaneously expecting that the only possible good reality is the one where your loved one is back at the same time as you're completely detached.
Right. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes.
You have to be like a yogi master at this.
Right. Which is
and most of us,
do. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like someone coming into a karate classroom and they want to be like Bruce Lee, and they want to do it in 3 steps. What are the 3 steps to be like Bruce Lee? It's like, well, you need to kick, punch, and block. But actually, it's this may take more than an afternoon or a few weeks.
Right.
So, and that's kind of the state where we're in. The good news is people are realizing this can be possible. And so that means we can get meditation masters who can start bringing back the dead. Now, is that a good thing? I'd say it's only good in the sense that it's the best for all concerned. I'm not advocating black magic here. I'm just saying this is the way the world works, and we're already doing it. So we can become exceptional humans by learning to work with this plastic reality in more exceptional ways.
And, and I think that's why I wanted to have this kind of conversation. I mean, look, some of the topics that we bring up on Higher Journeys Radio can be a little, probably overuse the word fringe, maybe even a little dark. But at the end of the day, Cynthia, what we're trying to do is show the breadth and scope of reality and how we are integral in forming reality. Which is a magnificent thing. So I hope that this conversation has helped a little bit in that regard. Fascinating stories, both of them. So, well, listen, before we go, I want to let you all know again that Cynthia is now one of our expert contributors for Higher Journeys. You can check out Cynthia's articles by simply going to higherjourneys.com. And in fact, she just posted a great piece on, guess what? Alternate realities from a quantum perspective. As always, she gives great insight into this still very new and uncharted territory. So make sure you visit higherjourneys.com and read her latest entry. And also make sure you go to her home online, which is realityshifters.com. So between the two, I think we've got you covered on the anomalies of reality, alternate realities, from the quantum optimist herself, Cynthia Sue Larson. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us again on such short notice. And
thank you. It's such a pleasure to talk about all this with you.
I love it. We can do it a lot. We'll be doing it again soon, I'm sure. So thanks again. I appreciate you. How good can it get? This is Cynthia's signature question, and an inquiry into the depths of reality that clearly has no boundaries. With what you've just heard, I think it's fair to say that the reality that you think you know may just be a figment of your imagination. What we call real may be just the tip of the iceberg. I encourage you to look deeper as you consider these ideas, and I also encourage you to check out more of Cynthia's great research at our home online, higherjourneys.com, where you can find some great articles, news, and views on all things alternative. Thanks as always for tuning in to Higher Journeys Radio. Until next time, I'm your host, Alexis Brooks.